I pushed open the front door and stepped into the familiar stillness of the house. The faint smell of autumn leaves clung to my coat, and the cool air whispered through the closing door. My husband was away on another business trip, and though his absence was routine by now, the silence always seemed heavier when he wasn't here. I dropped my purse on the entryway table and exhaled, the weight of the day pressing on my shoulders. The house felt empty, though I knew it wasn't. His truck was in the driveway, which meant my stepson was home. I figured he was upstairs in his room, likely lost in his own world of music or gaming. He was 23, quiet and fiercely independent. Our relationship was cordial, polite even, but there was always a distance between us, a boundary neither of us had ever tried to cross. I headed toward the kitchen, my heels clicking against the hardwood floor. I poured myself a glass of water, letting the coolness settle me. My mind wandered through my to-do list, emails to catch up on, laundry to fold, a bath to ease the tension in my neck. But something felt off. It was a small prickle of unease at the back of my mind. As I climbed the stairs to my room, a faint light caught my attention. The bathroom door was ajar, and the glow of the overhead light spilled into the dim hallway. The sound of running water came from inside, punctuated by splashes. I frowned. He was careful about his privacy, always shutting doors tightly behind him. I hesitated, my fingers hovering near the doorframe. "You okay?" I called softly, but the words felt like they were swallowed by the stillness. No answer. A cold knot twisted in my stomach. Maybe something was wrong. I tapped lightly on the door. "Hey, it's me." Still nothing. I pushed the door open an inch, just enough to see inside. He was standing at the sink, shirtless, his back to me. His head was bowed, shoulders tense. Water dripped from his hair and slid down his spine. He was gripping a washcloth, scrubbing his chest with a kind of urgency that made my breath catch. I knew I shouldn't be there, that I should turn away and leave him his space. But before I could retreat, the floorboard beneath my feet let out a faint creak. He froze. His head whipped around, eyes wide with surprise and something that looked like shame. His face flushed crimson. The washcloth slipped from his fingers, landing with a dull splat against the porcelain. I didn't hear you come in," he stammered, his voice tight. My cheeks burned. "I'm sorry," I blurted, backing up. "I didn't mean to." "Wait." His voice was strained, a raw edge of desperation beneath it. His eyes met mine, and for a heartbeat, the distance between us dissolved into something fragile and exposed. I froze, caught in his gaze, torn between stepping forward and fleeing. "What's wrong?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. His hands clenched around the sink, knuckles white. His jaw worked like he was fighting to keep something inside. The silence stretched until it felt unbearable. "I don't know," he said finally, his voice cracking. I can't explain it." The vulnerability in his words knocked the air out of me. He wasn't the reserved, composed young man I thought I knew. He looked lost, adrift in a sea of emotions he couldn't name. Against my better judgment, I stepped into the room, my fingers brushing his arm. The contact was fleeting, barely there, but enough to ground us both. "It's okay," I murmured. "You don't have to explain." He let out a shaky breath, his eyes glistening with something he didn't let fall. I stepped back, giving him space, the moment closing like a book. As I turned to leave, I felt the fragile web of our distance tear, leaving only threads of something new and uncertain. The next morning, the house felt like it was holding its breath. I woke early, the pale light filtering through the curtains, casting shadows on the walls. My mind replayed last night like a broken record, the hesitation in his voice, the vulnerability in his eyes. I shook my head, trying to clear it. Maybe we could just move past it, let it fade into the unspoken spaces we both maintained so carefully. I dressed and went downstairs, the familiar routine grounding me. The scent of coffee filled the air, and for a moment, I let myself relax. But when I stepped into the kitchen, the tension snapped back into place. He was there, leaning against the counter, a mug in his hand. He didn't look up. "Morning," I said, keeping my voice light. "Morning," he murmured, his gaze fixed on the swirling steam rising from his cup. The silence stretched out, too long, too loaded. I opened the fridge, pretending to look for something, giving us both a buffer. The cool air prickled my skin. Finally, I closed the door and turned back around. "Do you want some breakfast?" I asked. He shook his head. "I'm not hungry." I nodded, a knot of unease tightening in my stomach. The polite distance between us felt more like a wall now. He set his mug down, the clink of ceramic on the counter breaking the quiet. "I'm going out for a bit," he said, his eyes flicking to mine for just a second before sliding away. "I need to clear my head." "Okay." My voice was softer than I intended. "Take your time." He grabbed his keys and walked to the door. Just before he left, he paused, his hand on the doorknob. For a heartbeat, I thought he might say something, offer an explanation, or maybe just reassurance. But he didn't. The door clicked shut behind him, leaving me with nothing but the echo of his absence. I sat at the kitchen table, staring at the empty mug he'd left behind. A wave of helplessness washed over me. I hated this feeling, this sense that something was unraveling, and I couldn't stitch it back together. The day crawled by. I cleaned the house, answered a few emails, tried to distract myself. But everything felt off-kilter, like the ground had shifted beneath my feet. Every creak of the floorboards, every tick of the clock, reminded me of the silence that had settled between us. By the time evening rolled around, the sky was painted in muted shades of pink and gray. I heard the rumble of his truck in the driveway and felt my chest tighten. The door opened, and he walked in, his shoulders tense, eyes shadowed. "Hey," I said, the word almost a whisper. "Hey," he replied, his voice just as strained. He hesitated in the doorway, his fingers flexing at his sides. There was a question in his eyes, something he didn't know how to ask. I wanted to bridge the gap, to say the right thing, but the words tangled in my throat. "Can we talk?" he finally said. "Of course." I gestured to the living room, and we sat down on opposite ends of the couch, the distance between us feeling physical. He took a deep breath, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. "I'm sorry for everything. For making things weird." "It's not just you," I said gently. "We're both figuring this out." His gaze met mine, searching for something, maybe forgiveness, maybe just understanding. I leaned forward, closing the space between us just a little. The air felt fragile, like glass ready to crack. "We'll figure it out," I promised, the words steady even though my heart was pounding. For the first time in days, his shoulders relaxed. He nodded, a small, hesitant smile flickering across his face. It wasn't much, but it was a start. The days blurred into each other, a mix of strained silences and cautious glances. We were like two people walking on cracked ice, both terrified that one wrong step would send everything crashing into the freezing depths below. He spent more time out of the house, and I busied myself with tasks that didn't need doing. We were avoiding each other, pretending this strange distance was temporary, even though we both felt the permanence of it. One afternoon, as I sorted through a stack of unopened mail, the garage door creaked open. His truck rumbled into place, the engine cutting off abruptly. I waited, hands stilling on a pile of envelopes. Moments passed, and I heard nothing. Then, a muffled thud. Something was wrong. I hurried to the door that led to the garage and pushed it open. He was sitting on the concrete floor, his back against the workbench. His hands were tangled in his hair, his knees drawn up. A wrench lay beside him, a streak of grease on the floor where he'd dropped it. "Hey," I said gently, stepping inside. "What happened?" He didn't look up. His voice was low, defeated. "It's broken. Everything's broken." I glanced at the motorcycle he'd been working on for months, the one thing that usually gave him some peace. Pieces of the engine lay scattered, like a puzzle no one knew how to solve. I could feel the frustration radiating off him, the weight of everything pressing down. "Let me help," I said. He shook his head, his jaw clenched. "I can't do this anymore. I keep trying to fix things and they just get worse." I swallowed hard, the ache in my chest growing. "It's not just the bike, is it?" He finally looked at me, his eyes tired and lost.
No.
It's everything. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The quiet of the garage wrapped around us. I took a cautious step forward and knelt down beside him, close enough to show I was there, but not too close to make him retreat. You don't have to fix everything, I whispered. Sometimes it's okay to let someone else help carry the load. He closed his eyes, his shoulders trembling just slightly. When he opened them again, there was a raw honesty there that made my throat tighten. I just don't want to disappoint anyone. You haven't, I said firmly. We all have moments when we feel like we're falling apart. It doesn't mean you've failed. He let out a shaky breath, the tension in his posture easing just a little. Without thinking, I reached out and brushed a smudge of grease from his cheek. The touch was brief, but it felt like it meant something more. He leaned into it for just a heartbeat, his eyes meeting mine with a quiet vulnerability that made my chest ache. Thank you, he murmured. We stayed like that for a moment, the air between us calmer, less jagged. Then, he straightened up and ran a hand through his hair. I think I just need to step away from it for a bit. Clear my head. Okay? I said, offering a small smile. I'll be here. He nodded and stood, his movements a little steadier. He left the garage, the door swinging shut behind him. I stayed there for a moment, surrounded by scattered tools and unfinished repairs. The broken pieces could wait. Right now, what mattered was that, somehow, we were starting to understand each other. The sun dipped low, casting long shadows across the floor as I stood by the window, staring at the driveway. His truck was parked there, still and silent. It had been hours since he came back from his walk. The garage light was off, the house wrapped in a stillness that felt fragile, like glass ready to crack. I took a deep breath and headed upstairs. His door was slightly ajar, a thin line of light spilling into the hallway. I hesitated, memories of our strained conversations and missed connections swirling in my mind. But this time, I couldn't walk away. I knocked softly. Hey, can I come in? There was a pause, then his voice, quiet but steady.
Yeah.
I pushed the door open and stepped inside. He was sitting on the edge of his bed, elbows on his knees, fingers loosely clasped. His room was a mix of order and chaos, neatly stacked books beside piles of crumpled clothes. Sketches of motorcycle designs were taped to the wall, their edges curling slightly. He looked up, his eyes shadowed but clearer than they'd been in days. I've been thinking, he said, his voice low. About everything. I nodded, waiting, giving him space to find the right words. I've been holding on too tight, he admitted. To expectations, to fixing things that aren't even mine to fix. I thought if I just kept pushing, everything would make sense. But it doesn't work like that. No, it doesn't, I agreed softly. Sometimes, letting go is the hardest thing to do. He let out a breath, and for the first time in what felt like forever, his shoulders relaxed. I need to figure out who I am. Away from all of this. My heart clenched, but I nodded. I understand. He glanced around his room, his gaze landing on the sketches. I want to go away for a while. Maybe take that apprenticeship my friend mentioned out west. Work on bikes, learn something new. I swallowed the lump in my throat. That sounds like a good idea. He looked at me, then really looked at me. Are you okay with that? It wasn't about me. It never had been. I smiled, even though it hurt. I just want you to be happy. A small smile flickered across his face. Thank you. For everything. I stepped forward, and without thinking, I wrapped my arms around him. For a second, he froze. Then his arms came up around me, holding tight. It wasn't a desperate hold, not like before. This was something gentler, an acknowledgement of the journey we'd been through and the distance we'd both need to travel. When we pulled away, his eyes were brighter, a quiet determination in them. I'll keep in touch. I promise. I'll hold you to that, I said, my voice soft. The next morning, the sound of his truck's engine was a low rumble in the cool air. I stood on the porch, watching as he backed out of the driveway. He paused, his hand lifting in a small wave. I returned it, the ache in my chest a bittersweet mix of pride and loss. As he drove away, the road ahead of him long and open, I realized something. Sometimes, the best way to help someone grow is to let them go. The house felt quiet again, but this time, the silence wasn't heavy. It was filled with possibility, with the hope that we'd both find what we were looking for. I closed the door behind me, taking a deep breath. It was time to move forward, for both of us.